Thanks, Marcus. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to present a study I did as part of my PhD program, and just to give a bit of background, it's I suppose the PhD program is well, firstly it's informed by an ecological dynamics approach to sport performance, and just to clarify what we mean by athlete-environment relationship. So, an ecological dynamics perspective would really encourage and support athletes engaging with key information sources within the environment to inform or influence certain behaviour, high performing behaviours. So before I start, the theoretical background really, or within ecological dynamics, it's I suppose more geared towards the ecological psychology of James Gibson. So that work features heavily in this PhD program and also in this presentation. So just to sort of highlight where it fits. So it was the second study of 3 studies, and we also wrote a position paper just to outline where we're trying to go with the research. So this specifically looks at an ethnographic study that we conducted perhaps about 2 years ago now, and it aligns to trying to understand more about the different socio-cultural constraints and how they might influence coaches' ideas or ideals about what it means to be high performing in different sports. Just before I move on, I think it might be worth just clarifying a few key terms. I have put references at the bottom of the slides, just so you can, if people want to go and find more information, they can do. But I'll quickly cover a few key terms. So Gibson coined the term affordances to describe opportunities for action in the environment. And it's worth noting that affordances, so these opportunities for action, are subject dependent, okay, whereas affordances are not. How we act on these affordances are subject dependent, and although the ontology of affordances is still being fiercely debated, we follow a socio-cultural aspect of affordance, so a relationship between different socio-cultural practices and how an athlete or individuals engage with affordances. So think if we're all presented with the same scenario in a game of netball, for example, some of us may be solicited to act on that information, some of us may not, and the way we're trying to understand more about that is from a socio-cultural perspective. So that's affordances. The second key term is a form of life. So the idea around a form of life comes from the philosopher Wittgenstein, and it describes the everyday practices, cultures, attitudes, beliefs of a specific group, organisation. And in a recent paper, we tried to unpack what a form of life, or what influences a form of life. All right, so and we looked at these different systems, and we sort of theorised that all these different systems can influence specific attitudes and cultures within a certain organisation. So if you put at the centre of that, if we think about an ecological niche, so that is a talent development centre, it could be a team at work, it could be a wider department. The specific affordances available to people, or in a sports setting specifically, are highly dependent on all these different subsystems interacting and providing different opportunities. So if you think people that have taken part in sport or still taking part in sport, or even in a work setting, you might have worked in different environments that offer, some might be highly suppressive, some might encourage autonomy and things like that. So, and what we argue is that that's all dependent on all these different subsystems interacting to influence a specific ecological niche. So affordances form a life, that 2 key terms that are relevant to the study. By way of example, if we think about Dan Carter's time at racing, so for those who don't know, Dan Carter was an All Black, not a bad player. And he spent the sort of back end of his career at racing, so a French team in the obviously Northern Hemisphere. And Dan Carter has been quite open about this, that he had a very different experience of playing in the Northern Hemisphere than he did in the Southern Hemisphere. And that demonstrates two very distinct forms of life. And I'm not going to go into it now, but if we actually trace back New Zealand's heritage, that, and thinking about the previous slide, that really sort of exemplifies perhaps why Dan Carter came to those conclusions. So he felt it was very suppressive type of playing style when he was playing in France. So the justification then for study 2. So what we know lots about is the different types of practices in sport cultures, sport organisations, and these are well researched, well written about. So we've got things like masculine behaviours, reductionist and mechanistic attitudes towards performance. But what we don't know, and what there's very, very little written about, is that what does that actually mean for athlete behaviour? Okay, so in the sense of I'm in competition, I'm interacting with different different teammates, opposition, whatever the sport may be. What does that actually mean for my performance? So Amber and colleagues have argued for a deeper understanding of this. So they use a Foucauldian term called docile bodies, essentially. And what does this mean for docility producing effects of athletes? So essentially, that's what we aim to understand more about. So what we wanted to understand was the sociocultural practice of a specific sport organisation. So experience that firsthand, and then categorise the relationship with the existent form of life. And then using a Gibsonian perspective, we theorised what that actually meant for the athlete's interactions with the environment. So the way we went about doing that is that we conducted a 10-month ethnographic study where I was situated as a coach, so as a full participant within a British Rugby League academy. And then the data collection methods was observation, so regular observations, weekly observations, field notes were written away from the environment immediately after the experience, and then interviews were conducted as well with all the coaches and heads of performance in that club, in that Super League club. So what did we find? Well, so what we've got here is a thematic map. So on the right-hand side, we've got the higher dimensions, higher order themes, and then lower order themes. So in regards to the dimensions down the right-hand side, so starting with sociocultural practices, it was pretty evident very early on that disciplined behaviour and masculinity were the dominant sociocultural practices. And what we saw is that I'll focus on masculinity. There's a real value on being big and tough and being harder than your opposition player. And even with children sort of 15, 16 years of age, there was a real sort of value of that. The coaches really valued, and parents really valued, that type of thing. Of course, a sport like rugby league, that is a factor. Ability to deal with those types of things is a factor. But what I noticed is that it marginalised other abilities like being skillful, dexterity, and that type of thing. Moving down, and then it was very evident as well that the ecological niche, so what I mean by that is the talent development centre, was socially and culturally constructed. All right, so it was highly influenced by socio and cultural beliefs. And one of the things that we noticed, that traditions of practice, and when I was interviewing the coaches, this was like over generations and generations, that things like technique, training, and reductionism were really valued. And interestingly, the head of performance, well, even though he lived in the same sort of area as these of the coaches, he'd gone through a very academic route in terms of coach education and his own personal development, and he was trying to implement a different approach. more around decision making, autonomy, less focused on optimal movement techniques, and it sort of created a coaching paradox. But it was quite noticeable that the form of life was that powerful within the setting that traditions of practice always prevailed. And then finally, the athlete-environment relationship. We saw what I term loads of robotic players that couldn't think for themselves, highly dependent on the coaches telling them what to do. So if you were to go and observe a game, a match, you just hear constant commentary coming from the coaches, players just sort of losing the way within the game because they didn't always have that constant reassurance from the coach, and within practice and the games they were always reliant on external environmental features, so lots of instruction and set play. So they were always asking, what play are we playing now, how do we get to this area of the field, these types of things. And then, so what are the applied implications? So, so this bit is where we used a Gibsonian framework or theoretical framework to understand more about that. Well, the first thing is that players were highly responsive only to mainly sociocultural affordances. So within the field of play, they always chose to play safe. They would never take risks, as Dan Carter spoke about. They would never explore the environment, the affordance landscape, the physical environment. It was always playing very safe. So players became very redundant in the process. And practice presented lots of non-specifying information sources. So what I mean by that is information that would not necessarily lead to this tightly interrelated athlete-environment relationship. And essentially, they were captured by the system. The coaches and athletes and parents were captured by these socio-cultural constraints, which demonstrated how powerful the form of life was in regards to their perceptions of performance. And then, so what are the applied implications for practice design? Well, there's no silver bullet in regards to developing coaching ideas and maybe coach education, because we know it's very socially constructed. But again, moving back to Gibson's work, if we think about non-specified information and specified information, we need to support, or we need to not necessarily reject probably more coach education pathways and coaching approaches that are down the left-hand side of the continuum, but we need to try and promote coaching approaches that are more at the right-hand side of the continuum, so the rich information sources and the more specified information, because we know that leads to better skill transfer from practice to performance environments. So yeah, but as I say, it's not there's no silver bullet on that. And then limitations and future directions. So I'll start with the limitations at the bottom. So one thing I didn't do, or we haven't done across the PhD, is we haven't got an athlete's perspective on this. That was really because I've adopted a critical realist perspective to understand why certain behaviours are taking place. So really doing a job on the socio-cultural background. So next steps will be more phenomenological based studies, where we're trying to understand first-hand athletes' experiences of what it means to be solicited by affordances, but combining that with quantitative data, so performance analysis data and assessment, those types of things, to get a better and more insightful understanding of the environment or the athlete-environment relationship, what can contribute towards that. And just on that, one thing we have done recently is we've written a position paper about co-design, where athletes and coaches should co-design practice environments to invite relevant solicitations to inform performance. And then one other thing is that future research as well that we're planning at the minute is to try and explore different forms of life in different environments, and sort of to support performance managers to understand that there's all these different subsystems interacting on the pathways that they manage, the pathways that they're trying to implement. So that's something that I need to be aware of. It's not just the immediate activity that's taking place within that ecological niche. So yeah, there's lots to be getting on with. There's lots of plans and research designs being developed at the minute that we're going to explore those areas in more depth. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Any questions?
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Martyn. I know we've got one quick question from Chris Platts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martyn. My question really was around the behavioural expectations. I got the feeling when you were talking that you were talking about the coach's behavioural expectations onto the players. Did that at all contradict with the behavioural expectations that the players had between themselves? I'm thinking like laddish banter, acting the fool, because you sort of talked about it being quite disciplined.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Just to clarify that, it wasn't necessarily they wanted people to behave in, like we hear lots of things about cultural expectations in terms of, you turn up in certain clothing and that type of thing. It wasn't necessarily that. It was more about they wanted them to behave in certain ways on the practice field. So I'll give you an example. So the warm-ups were really rigid in terms of 0 minute to 3 minutes you did this, then 4 minutes do you know what I mean? So they were doing very specific things at specific time points. So, and when players alleviated from that and started playing like little touch games and that type of thing, some of the coaches really get stuck into them in terms of like, telling them off and saying, oh, it's not the sort of behaviours we expect here and all that type of thing. Whereas, so it wasn't necessarily in regards to banter, whatever that means, and all that type of thing. It was more about their expectations of behaviour on the field of play and the actions they were expected to carry out.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Chris. I think we've got a question also from James.
Cheers, Martyn. Enjoyed that. Just a quick one about concussion. Obviously, concussion is big in the news at the minute, not least of...
Oh, James Sherrington.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, concussion is big in rugby, isn't it, as it is elsewhere. I just wondered whether this form of life might help us to explain why, and if so, how rugby players are more sort of willing to expose, certain rugby players are willing to expose themselves to the kind of risks of concussion, and also maybe why certain individuals might play down the consequences of those risks.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost a badge of honour, isn't it? Well, it is in rugby league. If how hard you can hit somebody, if you get a concussion, it was. I mean, we did have examples of that in the academy where players would still come to practice, but they'd been concussed at the weekend, so they would come and observe. So they'd be there in the tracksuit watching, and it was almost a badge of honour, like, oh, I got knocked out on the weekend, or so. And I think again, you can directly relate that back to the, this idea of masculinity and being tougher and harder than somebody else, which is a concern. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, and interested with that as well, Jim. I think you got to think about the way a lot of teams will practice tackling. So there'll be lots of tackle shields and these types of things. So they're not actually being supported to develop an effective athlete-environment relationship, i.e. perceiving different shapes and sizes of attacking players and then understanding what that might mean for their position in terms of the tackle. So tackling all the time with tackle shields is probably contributing to, I think anyway, and theory would suggest is probably contributing to these issues with poor tackling technique in regards to getting head injuries and putting yourself in awkward situations, positions to make tackles. So I think it's all related, absolutely. But unfortunately, it's not very valued, this perspective. Yeah. Coaches like lots of numbers and facts and figures. And if they haven't got that, they struggle a little bit, I think. Yeah.
Great stuff. Okay. Okay, if we don't have any more immediate questions, I think we're just cautious of or aware of time rather. So thanks so much for your talk this afternoon, Martyn. Very interesting to listen to that. So thank you very much.